a real techie guy. I absolutely love technology. I grew up in the 70s and 80s when technology was brand new. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And I've really kind of, my real thing that I've done my entire career is I'm what's called a futurist. It's a total ridiculous title that means nothing, other than the fact that I like to be able to use psychology and things that I've kind of been educated in to understand the past and how that changes what we do in the future, which really led me to game design, because believe it or not, that's really what game design is. Predicting players' future is a huge part of what we do. I spread out some games across the table. I do this every time I go somewhere. You guys are horrible. I'll just let you know. Nobody played except one group. I know it can be intimidating to see a game you don't know, but it's always fun for me to watch to see who will jump in and play. And I'm going to talk about some time I spent with a company called Hasbro, which I'm sure you've heard of, which we really talk about play. I'm not going to try not to trip here. I'm really today kind of geared towards this. This is what it is, this never-ending quest for an epic win. Have any of you guys heard of that term, epic win? How many of you play games? You? How many of you play games on anything other than a phone? Really? Oh, I'm so glad. I'm really glad to see that. So there's some interesting numbers I'm going to show here too about how many people are actually playing games. And a lot of times when I ask if you're playing games, people won't raise their hand until I say, do you play on a phone? Then most everybody does play some sort of game, have some kind of gaming experience on the phone. As far as me, I don't know what happened to that picture. It's on here too. Kind of cut out some of the titles. I'm an author. It's really been a passion of mine. I've always loved storytelling. I haven't always loved reading, which I'm going to talk a little bit about too. But I have 10 books out now. I have a series. Those microsource books are kind of like Honey, I Shrunk the Kids meets Jurassic Park. Definitely for younger readers. How many of you are in like K through 5? All right, so those are your books. What you want. This book, Game On, its top left corner, is kind of like my love letter to the history of video games. I've really been passionate about the history of video games and what it's done for us as a community. That's probably for like the 4th, 5th, 6th graders, maybe junior high age. And then this one here that I'm going to probably talk about the most, this Greatest Stories Ever Played, is probably for high school age. This is a little bit more academic than the others. Kind of digs into why video games are interesting at telling stories and do they deserve their space in literature. So that's kind of what this book is about. So yeah, these are the books I'm probably the most well known for. They're the ones I talk about the most because of course my background is a huge part of that, but the other part of that is just I'm extremely passionate about nonfiction and how we can use that storytelling inside nonfiction to kind of, one, foster a love of learning and foster a love of reading, but also to like show you that sometimes true stories are better than the ones we make up. So I'm going to tell you, oh, by the way, this probably says a lot about my psyche. I love bad reviews. I collect them like a dragon hoards gold. So I'm going to share some of my all-time favorites from this book because it's been out the longest, so I have a lot. I think they're absolutely hilarious. This is what I got probably about 5 days after my book came out. I thought this was really fun. If I was 13, this would be the best book I've ever read. But I'm 32, so I'm giving it 1 star. I absolutely love this. It's hilarious. The thing I probably love most about it is that his name was Sir Thomas on Goodreads. So I'm pretty sure that's his battle tag or his gamer tag that he uses too. Because nobody hates games more than gamers. That's absolutely true. This is a fun one. I think I skipped every other chapter of this book. Those were the good ones. I don't understand. But how does this guy call himself a video game historian without covering Pokemon or GTA? Is this a joke? By the way, Texas hates my book. There's so many of these. So this is a kind of an interesting. Oh, so this is the guy that skipped. Wondered why I didn't cover Pokemon and GTA. Why is this not explained? I'm sorry. What happened here? Let me try this again.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, sorry, Grand Theft Auto. Something's quite not quite updated. Alright, we're gonna try this again. Does this work? I can't get it forward for slides. Okay, there we go. So this is the guy who's worried that I covered those. Those are actually in my book. So I'm missing those in some of the chapters that he skipped. They're pretty obvious too. So this is me. It might help to kind of see more like this. This is probably more like me. But really, I haven't changed much since then. We're going to have some weird problems. I'm terribly sorry. Hopefully this is going to keep going. Oh, this is crazy. I'm so sorry. But I want to talk to you about this space here. Does anybody recognize what this might be? Bookmobile. Yeah, I wish I was prescient enough in 1978 to actually have taken this photo, but I didn't. This is what I found online, probably like how all of us find pictures. So in 1978, my family moved from Salt Lake City to Ephraim, Utah. Pretty small town, if you guys are familiar with it. I'm sure you are. I didn't have much say in the matter. I was 8, so it turns out when your parents get jobs, you go with them. So I ended up losing my family network, a lot of cousins that all lived like within walking distance to each other, and 2 really good friends who my mom they used to call it babysitting, but I think it's called daycare now. Kind of ran that for them. So I lost everything to me. And I moved down to Ephraim, Utah, where there was nothing that I was familiar with. And I was kind of a loner kid anyway. I had 2 sisters. I loved them very, very much, of course. But they were very much like they're older than me. They were very involved in the type of stuff my parents were involved with, which was music and musical theater. And that's just not me. That just didn't click. And so I was this immediate latchkey kid. Like the day I moved down there, I was kind of a loner. And across the street from our house was a ballpark. And in the parking lot of the ballpark, this magical thing showed up. Right? It was a library on wheels. And I'd never seen one in my entire life. I'm sure they had them in Salt Lake, but I didn't know that they had them. And I actually thought this was the only one on planet Earth. Like, I really thought it was like magical kingdom. So one of the great things that this person who was running the bookmobile did at the time is they gave me one of these. You guys remember this program? I'm really dating myself here. So you guys probably remember this more as the Pizza Hut program, right? Yeah. So this booklet was the thing that you would get. You could get a pin for free, which was awesome. Everybody wanted a pin. But you'd also get a little slip of paper and it had a slot for 8 different books. And if you read 8 books throughout the summer, you could take it to Pizza Hut and get a personal pan pizza, which, to an 8-year-old is like the greatest thing you could ever imagine. So this gave me all kinds of hope that there was a Pizza Hut in Ephraim. There was not. So that was kind of a bummer. I think the closest one was Ridgefield at the time. I'm not sure even when that was built, but I was pretty excited about this whole thing. But what I realized, and I didn't know until then, that reading was a little different for me than everybody else. And I guess being in 1st and 2nd grade, it hadn't come up yet, right? Enough that I knew it. But this is me. Is that actually working? Right? This is me. This is exactly who I am. And I actually created this by grabbing a page and doing kind of the manipulation on myself. This is how I read. This is what I see. And if I really focus, I can usually see a couple of words really clearly, and then the rest of it kind of sizzle around. Right? And I had no idea that this was unique when I was in 1978, in between 2nd and 3rd grade. Matter of fact, I didn't know when I was in 3rd, 4th, or 5th grade. It wasn't until junior high until I heard the term dyslexia. So until then, things were different back then, right? Different support networks. We had different types of accommodation. I think accommodation was kind of almost nothing at that time. I was the kid who couldn't read. So I got yanked out of class. Brand new kid who didn't know anybody yet to kind of go read with, I'm going to say it, it's terrible, the dumb kids. Right? That's what I was called. A lot worse, too, as you can imagine. Words kind of popped around in the 70s that we don't talk about anymore. And it was hurtful, very, very hurtful for me. And it made me just think, like, I'll never, ever get through this. I'll never learn how to read, which is frustrating because I love stories a lot. So I had this empty card of 8 books that I had to read for the summer to get free pizza. I checked out a book, of course, from the bookmobile because that's what you do, and I was super excited about it. And the librarian inside the bookmobile was great. He was a very kind man. I wish I knew his name. I can't remember it.
Mr. Perry, yeah.
What's that?
Mr. Perry.
Yeah, that's exactly who it is. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Okay. So I checked out a couple of books. I don't remember what the first ones were, but I promise I did not finish reading those books. And when I brought him back, he's like, "How's the book?" He was like super personal. He knew every book in the bookmobile. And I kind of tried to fumble my way through it, said I liked it. Happened for about half the summer until he brought me this. Can you imagine what a horrible librarian this was? He didn't know that I was dyslexic at the time, but he knew that I was checking out books and I wasn't finishing them. So he's like, "Try these. These count on your list of free pizza books." So I devoured these books. And I'm not kidding, they're the exact same 3 covers. And I actually have the middle one still. So that's actually a scan from my original copy. But here's the interesting thing, there was no tags on the back. There was no barcode to scan out. Well, they didn't have those anyway. There was no pocket in the front for you to stamp, right? These were his books that he gave to me. The thing with this that worked obviously is I had visual context to go against, right? So I could read these books without reading these books, but I was more interested in really what was really happening. I wanted those details, and so it forced me to go in and read inside those text bubbles. It was absolutely monumental in my development. It was huge for me. And by the end of the year, by the end of the summer, he'd given me 2 other books, right? Small gash engine repair, like that is so not me. But I loved it. And the reason I loved it is because, once again, it was packed with visual content, right? Tons of diagrams, really neat, kind of cool, intricate drawings of how engines work. But to read it was like miles above my reading level. It wasn't even in the stratosphere, but I read that entire book. And then this one, Men of the North, once again, it's probably not like terribly culturally appropriate, but it was really fun, and it was like packed full of adventures. The very first book that I read. Right? So those early books stick with me today. It's an interesting thing, and really the main thing that he did was he fostered this love of learning that I didn't know that I had. And really, they kind of ended up by the time my reading kind of changed, the way I absorbed media changed when I met this guy. Most of you know at least what this is. This is kind of generic video game guy. This is Space Invaders. So it's still 1978. When I first saw this, I will never forget it. At the time, my parents were already in the music theater program. They had like a summer college program, like theater program that was there. My parents were both teaching, taught at Snow College. My dad was in the orchestra, my mom played piano, and she did costumes, and both my sisters were already like involved. And so, like I said, I was a latchkey kid. And I remember my dad would give me like 50 cents to $1, which I thought was nothing back then, and it really was something pretty meaningful to him. We didn't have a lot of money growing up. And I remember walking into the Snow College Union building, and I saw this cabinet with this incredible drawing of an alien on the side of it. And I heard this, dun, 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 over and over again. Amazing soundtrack. Like better than Jaws. So I remember the very first time I played this game, it lasted almost no time at all. I didn't have any idea what was happening. But I played it, and I kept playing it, and I kept dropping quarters in this thing for an entire year until I became extremely good at this game. Matter of fact, like savant level good as an 8-year-old. And then when college kids came back to school, they would give me quarters to play the game to show them how good I was at it. I was like this little baby superstar. So that year, 1978, kind of like really kind of decided for me who I was. And it was mostly based on the media that I was consuming. Luckily, I had a mentor, a guide, Mr. Perry, that provided me with the right books and showed me that reading wasn't always cracking open an encyclopedia or some big heavy thing, that reading was meant to be fun and engaging. And then I met this side of me, which was really completely different for me, to kind of decide what video games were. And the interesting thing for me with video games is that no one else in my family quite got it. And I kind of liked that too. It was mine, right? It was a very individual thing for me. Okay, so I'm a little bit ahead of myself. Let's go back a little bit. Let's go back 35,000 years. Right? Does anyone know where this is from? This is very famous. This is from Lascaux, France. So this is where we're going to start talking about technology. Right? Because this is kind of the first lucky thing that happened in human history. This is the first recorded history we have of figurative art. art that meant something. Art that told a story. The interesting thing about this is that we shouldn't have it. Right? So this was done with yellow ochre, which you guys have heard of. It's still a current common color that artists use today, which is ground up dried plants, and burnt ochre, which is those same plants burned to a charcoal form. It's an incredibly non-permanent medium, right? So when people painted with this stuff, it didn't stay around. This was a fairly decent-sized civilization. They think between 60 and 150 people that lived in this cave system in France called it's from a place called Lascaux. It shouldn't be here, but an earthquake happened and it locked off a huge section of that cave. And it made it so no oxygen could even get there. That's how tight the lock was, right? So there was very, very little atmosphere in this cave for about 35,000 years. And no joke, another earthquake happened and opened it up, right? Like divine earth shaking, whatever, right? So we have this cool recorded history, and you really can't call that technology. Most of that's luck, right? Even this would have been lost to us if it weren't for this kind of interesting mistake that happened. And we kind of have to fast forward about another, I think this was like 5,800 years ago, right? This is cuneiform. This was definitely technology, right? Because fire is technology. And then they had fire at the time of Lascaux. They actually had fire way before that, 150,000 years ago. But this one was pretty interesting because what they learned is that you could press these things into clay, and you could bake them, and then they would stay forever. So we have these really nice, like very well preserved versions of cuneiform. But unfortunately, being that that process was so laborious, and it's not like you can say, here, read my book, clunk, right? Very few people read. Very few people were literate at this time. Right? So this is kind of an interesting thing. And that moved forward once we had papyrus, right, which is 2,400 years ago. So now instead of having these big clunky bricks that you really couldn't share. And by the way, these weren't even fiction at all. Most of this was like accounting of crops and crop rotation and its numbers, you know. So probably not the stuff that we would enjoy reading today. Papyrus came out, and now technology was paper-based, right? Smashing reeds, drying reeds, stretching reeds, being able to do this. It wasn't as permanent, but it was way more portable. And so that technology allowed more and more people to read. Or to at least even want to read, or even to know that reading was a thing, right? This is not that long ago before we kind of had this kind of idea. And papyrus ended up being a pretty big thing as far as like human development, right? Stories that we could tell. And now instead of it being all, you know, this boring accounting stuff, sorry, I hope there's no people who are accountants in here. Now other things are recorded. Histories, which were very biased, right, but interesting, were recorded, and even early versions of fiction were recorded in papyrus, which is really cool to see. Things really changed when this happened. Gutenberg Press, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. When we had the Gutenberg Press, now all of a sudden people could print multiple copies of things, right? More distribution, more technology. It's kind of a cool way to kind of look at this stuff. But things really didn't change until this point in time. All of my notes are probably so this is the invention of the radio. So radio's not even that old, right? It's less than 160 years old. But this concept of being able to now not just, you don't even record it. A story can happen, someone can show up to the radio station and distribute that story to multiple people, right? So even though we've moved aside from reading, it continued to like educate us, it continued to like raise the bar for everyone, right? Raise the tide. And this continues to move on with Muybridge, right? So you guys have all seen the Muybridge photos. Muybridge was kind of the first one who's really given credit for doing moving pictures, right, before film. And this certainly is something that we all consume. It's a very passive form of entertainment. It's fascinating and it's wonderful, and we all love it. And then this one, which actually came from the great state of Utah, right? So this is the invention of the television. So the interesting thing about these technologies is that every time those technologies happen, media gets created on those technologies, which is great. But the thing that's interesting is that our ability to communicate as a human species has grown and grown and grown and grown exponentially because of this. This is a really interesting picture for me because we can look at kind of like some of these first things that happened on these media that were kind of big, right? The Gutenberg Bible obviously is something we still talk about today. All these type of early media are things that we can still consume today. And the interesting thing is that even though we might be consuming different media, we're still basically using the exact same format. So you can read a book. By the way, I just finished Jamie Ford's Many Daughters of a Fawn. Oh my gosh. If you have a chance, if you want to give yourself a gift, it is just an absolutely beautiful book. So that's why it's there. But a lot of these forms of media, the way we consume them, really haven't changed in like 120 years, give or take a decade, right? So definitely we consume television differently now, right? Like binging is a new kind of thing that's happened in the last 10 years for TV watchers. It's actually something that happened about 25 years for video gamers, that same binging mentality. But the interesting thing is that not much has changed until this again. Right? So here's the thing that's really compelling to me with this concept of games is how absolutely small they are in the list of human history. We're going to take a peek at that here in just a minute. So if we look at like human evolution, right? If we go to 12 million years back, at the times before we were actually moving, standing up, like walking around, that's a pretty long gap. But really, kind of the most interesting one to me is when we get to this point where we're starting to stand up. Like 5.2 million years ago. That's an incredible amount of time. And when we look at kind of what we really know, which is the Homo sapiens side of it, it's 200,000 years. And that's a very exaggerated blip. That is not really 200,000 years. I just wanted to show up on PowerPoint better because I actually kind of tried to do the math because I'm a nerd, and it was less than a pixel. Right? So, I mean, this is like an incredibly small amount of human history, or amount of time in bloom. So, if we look at like kind of the history that we know very well, the history of Homo sapien, like a lot of these things that we've talked about today fit on this timeline. Like the caves in Lascaux, France, is actually, well, first dogs domesticated, 31,000 years is really important for me because I love my dog. But oldest figurative art, 38,000 years ago, right? That's Lascaux, France. That's the first time we saw art that represented us. So it's a pretty neat thing to think Homo sapiens were trying to draw themselves. Like that concept of self-awareness was really, it's pretty old. It's been around for a long time. But you can kind of keep going forward, and you can kind of see some of these other things that we've talked about today. But probably the one that kind of is interesting to me here is that we think of things like the first person to reach the South Pole in 1911. Radio was invented by then, and film was invented by then. Right? Film was about 20 years old at the time. Radio was about 40 or 50 years old. So it's a pretty interesting thing that's happening. And we think of that as fairly modern history. Certainly when we say World War I, right? World War II, the Apollo moon landing in 1969, important to me because that's the year I was born. But when I look at that and I say, that little arc coming off the back between Apollo moon landing and the World Wide Web invented between 1969 and 1979 is when video games started. Like, it's a teeny tiny blip on this entire thing. It's incredible to think like where we've kind of come to this point where we have this amazing understanding of kind of our current modern history. It's all encapsulated in this thing. But when you think of the amount of information that we possess compared to what's been possessed even 50 years ago, it's incredible. There's no wonder why students are overwhelmed. This is a huge amount of information. Take a drink while you cough at this slide because it's pretty shocking. So, by the way, if you ever have to do a PowerPoint presentation and you want some fancy charts, marketingcharts.com is awesome. They'll actually prepare charts for you. If you're like, here's some data that I have on how to make a pretty chart, you can send it to them and make you a chart for free. But they also have tons that are already kind of there. So this is pretty interesting. This is the percentage of Americans playing video games. That is an unbelievable percentage. The fact that it only went up from 73 to 79, I think is shocking to a lot of people. That's the COVID year, where I think a lot of people are like, oh, I'm going to go home and play games. They were already doing it. It's kind of part of the takeaway. And the drop-off between coming back to normal life and being in the COVID years really hasn't been that dramatic. But the interesting thing is that the amount of hours that we play went up and it continues to go up. This might seem like a lot, 16 and a half hours a week, and probably most of you are like, there's no way I spend that much time. But don't worry, I spend enough that I'm helping smash that average on the other side. I play a lot of games. Part of it's my job.
How many of you play Pokemon Go?
Yeah, that's a good question.
No, I'm just saying there's a lot of people, you know what I mean? Are,
Oh yeah, yeah. Phones are definitely the way that most people are consuming games right now. So I did the math for us, so we didn't have to. I did remember how to do percentages, even though when I was in school we were told not to use calculators, which probably, I mean, most of you are probably in that same boat, right? Like you have to know how to do the math, right? I could have done this on paper. I would have probably come up with the wrong answer. So I'm glad I learned how to use a calculator. But I'm going to talk a little bit about this too, about the concept of the calculator, because it really does feed into kind of this whole thing. This concept of should we be using the tools that are available to us so that we can solve more complex social problems? It's a really good question. This is what it ends up being. 4.1 billion hours playing online games a week. Not a year, a week. Right? It's a lot. And what would you say if I told you, is this not enough? Right? I think we need more. How's that for a person to tell a bunch of librarians who are trying to get people to read? I think we need this. I think we need 21 billion hours a week of gaming. And the reason I say that is more focused on the next generation than it is this current generation. Gen Z, my favorite people. And here's why. So there's an artist, photographer named Phil Satora. This guy does a lot of really amazing photographs in a lot of different areas. But this one is exactly right. He wanted to capture what it's like to play games in photographs. So these were photographs that were taken in big moments while these people were playing games. For you, the gamers among you, might pick out some different subtleties here, but for non-gamers, I think you might see some pretty obvious ones. Shock, like surprise, wonder, awe, this kind of idea. But if you kind of like, this guy in the top left is my personal favorite. I think he's just hilarious. I've felt that. There's a little fear in there too, right? It's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I did this. This concept of like super optimism is hard to kind of define. So it's actually a term that psychologists use now, which is called the epic win, and it came from playing games. So the concept of an epic win isn't just winning. It's this. When they started playing the game, they trusted enough in themselves that they knew that they would beat the game. They trusted in the people who wrote the rules for the game, that they wouldn't put them in a position where they would fail too much. Eventually, they'd be able to succeed. And usually, these happen after repeated failure. Right? The concept of death in video games is a fascinating concept, like how we handle that, and why we call it death rather than reset. And when you talk to gamers, they're perfectly capable and comfortable saying, oh, I died 1,000 times to get there. Right? That's a really common kind of mentality. But when they get past it, that epic win is such an incredibly unique and personal and individual thing that they feel. But it's fascinating that we all use the same facial expressions to express that. It's a very common human emotion. We want that concept of an epic win. This is an older game. It's still out now, called World of Warcraft. Anybody here play World of Warcraft? This is showing your true nerd card. We have one. Right? World of Warcraft is kind of interesting. I think if I would have asked even this group 10 years ago, more of you would have been playing it. It's kind of fallen out of the mainstream, and it's kind of stuck more with kind of an avid, like what they would call a hardcore gamer. World of Warcraft is really interesting because it's extremely communal. Right? So large groups of people, sometimes up to 100 people simultaneously, will get together and will quickly assign world-saving, end-of-world saving opportunities to individuals. You do this, you do this, you do this, you do this. Right? And it's this community that comes together to solve massive, massive problems in the world of Azeroth. Right? And I know what you're thinking, that's not Earth. But there's a really interesting thing that's happening here. When we have people who have never met, but they're willing to play together. They're willing to solve problems together, which is an incredible thing to do. And not only that, they're doing it because they want to, right? You don't go, how can I say this best? There's no unemployment in the World of Warcraft. You don't join the game to sit. You join the game to solve a problem. Right? It's a really very interesting human condition that we have here. And the other interesting thing, it's So these numbers were actually pulled 2 years ago, so it's 2020. But at that point, World of Warcraft gamers had spent 5.93 million years playing World of Warcraft. That is a huge amount of time, but it's eerily similar to this. So in the same amount of time, if we consider human hours spent, players in World of Warcraft have spent as much time on that problem as we have been walking as our ancestors have been walking. Right? It's kind of an interesting thing to kind of see that happen. And you know, we kind of, back to this whole thing, right? Like, we've already gone back. It's really interesting when only we compare kind of the impact of what these games are having on our society is to look at it in the scale of human evolution. Like, that's a big scale, way big. So here's another couple interesting things. And this 10,000 hours is a really, really interesting thing. How many of you guys have heard what does 10,000 hours bring up to you guys? Have you read Malcolm Gladwell? Yeah.
That's how long it takes to really become an expert at something.
Yes, exactly. So Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book in 2009. Holy cow, can't believe it's been that long. Called Outliers, and it talked about what it takes to become a virtuoso or to become an expert in any topic. And its dedicated study at 10,000 hours is the accepted amount that says you're an expert. And of course, give or take, you know, depending on different things. But we use this 10,000 hours thing almost inherently. Like, we don't even think about it. So this, I thought, was also a very interesting thing when it comes to 10,000 hours. If you have perfect attendance, which I'm sure all the students in your schools do, from 5th grade to the high school graduation is 10,080 hours. Really interesting. So here's the thing that's really fascinating about this is that 10,080 hours is actually happening usually simultaneously for these people in your schools who are living in a completely separate life. And they're playing in some sort of online cooperative format where they've also earned 10,000 hours. It's really fascinating when you kind of think of that. When we look at kind of general education, it's not 10,000 hours being an artist. It's 10,000 hours becoming kind of an adult. Right? That's kind of what school is. Right? You learn a little bit of everything. You're not an expert. You're just ready to start. But simultaneously, a lot of these people have already been spending those 10,000 hours. So we kind of come up to this question is, what are they spending 10,000 hours being good at? Not thinking of proposition now that I look at it. That's the question that I think is worth asking. If you're going to be, I know it's pretty common, we kind of have this perceived joke of what a gamer is, right? Lives in their parents' basement, kind of maybe a little bit of dropout, diet consists of Doritos and Mountain Dew, and we kind of have this perceived, you know, you're wasting your life. There's a wonderful meme that goes around the game dev community where someone dies and he goes and meets St. Peter in pearly gates and he says, I feel like I've wasted my life. I spent my entire life making games. And he says, I have news for you. You did spend your entire life making games. You didn't just waste your life, you wasted the life of thousands of other people too.
So having kids that have grown up playing video games, and now they're graduating college, getting jobs, they're very good at solving problems. They're very good at looking at something in a different way than what someone older like I would look at.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're very good at solving those problems.
Yeah, definitely. So I was lucky enough to spend 3 years working with Hasbro, which was kind of a dream gig for me. I've been in the games industry for a long time, and I always admired Hasbro. And it's part of that was that my wife was also an elementary school teacher, and I got to see what some of the early games that they were building, what they were doing for child development, and the importance of play. So I was very interested in that whole concept of, like, why do people play, and how do they play, and what does play buy us? Like, should we be looking at things like playing video games as a waste of time, or should we try to find out why people are doing that? It's kind of why I put these games on the table here. And it doesn't really work with you people because most of you know each other, at least in isolated groups. When I do these presentations to people who might be coming in as strangers, like at a conference, like a FanX or a Comic-Con type thing, most of them don't know each other. And it's shocking how many of them will grab the game rather than introduce themselves to somebody. Right? It's a great way to introduce yourself. So one of the experience that I was able to work with Hasbro was, it was quantitative, not qualitative. I'm sure all of you know what that is. It's certainly something that hits education, where it's kind of hard to extrapolate actual data from it. Most of it becomes somewhat anecdotal, and it requires a lot of observation, right, and a lot of interview after. So we had about 2,000 people, which is a pretty decent amount of number for a qualitative test. Broke them into two groups, as you do. The first group was brought into a room in groups of 4, and they had 15 minutes to solve a problem. And the problems were extremely complex. There was about 5 of them, but they were along the lines of things like this. Earth will run out of food in 24 hours. What are you going to do to feed us? Like, what are we going to do? All of your common conventions of how food is produced are gone. What are you going to do? And to see what they would do that in 15 minutes, with 4 people, we would come up with sometimes 3 or 4 ideas out of that group of 4. None of them were remarkable. They were all kind of, back to hunter-gatherer was usually kind of the answer for those type of things. What are we going to possibly do? With tons of cannibalism jokes, which were funny for a minute, until you see that every single group says that, and then you wonder, what are we? But the other group had the same amount of time. But before they were given the question, they had 10 minutes to play a game. So the games were randomly selected from Hasbro's closet, of course, right? So Boggle and games that people probably already knew the rules to. One of the ones is back there somewhere where it just asks random questions, right? Nobody read the rules, they just read the questions and laugh and get to know each other. And then they had 5 minutes to solve the same problem. And the solutions were through the roof. They were cooperative. They thought about them together as a group. They would usually come with one single solution. The question did not ask for one. It just said, give us an answer. Maybe giving an answer might be kind of neat. But the difference between playing first and talking about it later was remarkable. Like, it's an unbelievable amount of cooperation that happens when we play before we start. And the other thing that was also really interesting for us to find out was that most of the strangers who didn't play left the room without asking a very, very simple question. What's your name? And most people who played, that was one of the first questions that was answered, right? There's a really interesting thing when you play of wanting to know the identity of the person that you're cooperating with. Right? Solving a problem without knowing that really kind of takes the humanity out of the problem solving, which is a really kind of problematic thing. So these are the things that I've kind of come up with that are really kind of what these people who play online are good at. This concept of urgent optimism is one that I really love. Right? It is that thing when I said, like, there's no unemployment in World of Warcraft. It's, you go in with this optimism that you're going to do something. You don't even know what it is, right? And even if you die multiple times, or you lose, or you fail, whatever that version of fail is, that optimism isn't crushed. It's continuing. Right? It moves on and on. That's definitely one that I thought was pretty interesting. The other thing that we see with these gamers is that they're very, very good at weaving what we call social fabric. It is that, what is your name, where are you from, kind of questions that we ask each other. It helps me, too, like when I present, to kind of find out, that is in Manti, Juna, I think. Right? I kind of try to pick those things out without asking. The way more effective way would be for me to step each with where he's from, right? It really definitely helps kind of build that connection. And it's a fascinating thing when we know that differently. We have that little tiny bit of social fabric, how much more we trust each other. And that's the thing that's interesting to me. When I talked about World of Warcraft, when somebody enters the game and you're like, oh, I need someone to do this. Those tasks aren't simple. Those tasks are big. But just the fact that I know that you've gone through the same process that I have, you've played the game enough to be at the same level that I'm at. I know what your background is. I know what you've gone through. I can empathize. And I'm willing to trust you with these other things that I might not be able to do. Like, that's an incredibly tough thing to teach. Like, if that was a class you had to teach, well, you could just have them play games. Probably fix it. This one's also really interesting. Blissful productivity is really fascinating. I know some of you who probably have teenagers are frustrated when you're like, I'm only asking you to clean your room, right? You're not asking a lot here. And for those of you who teach, it's the same kind of thing. I just need you to read this 15-minute take-home book and bring it back in a baggie. That's it. That's not a lot, right? But in games, people do this inherently. They love to be productive. And what we know from human psychology is that happy people, happy is a very, very cool and awesome loose term, are usually people who find more joy in being productive than they do in being restful. It's a really interesting thing. There's a psychologist named Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. Good luck spelling it. I'll help you. I know how to spell it. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. He wrote the thing. You could just type Mihai, M-I-H-A-I. See, dyslexic person trying to do letters in their hair. It's incredible. Mihai, and then type psychology of flow. It talks about how to be happy. Totally different presentation, but fascinating. That is what game design is. It's this concept of giving people tasks that are on the edge of their skill level, not above. Above causes frustration, not below. Below causes boredom. What's that sweet spot? And how do I know this group of people who are all diverse, have very interesting backgrounds, actually have a lot of commonalities too, which is kind of neat. How could I design something that all of you would find at that sweet spot? That's a great question to ask. And how to do that for students is also a fascinating question to ask. Some of this comes with this concept of giving people things to do that are rewarding. Okay, and this one probably speaks for itself. Gamers are excellent at failure. One of the things I've noticed as being a creative, being a writer and a game developer, is that most of what I do is subjective. The bulk of what I do. I've quite often thought I should have been a mathematician because I can prove that 2 + 2 is 4, and then I spoke to a mathematician that said, even that's subjective, and let me tell you why. Right? Like, most of what we do as humans is extremely subjective. The best way to get to an answer usually isn't to get the right one. It's usually to eliminate a lot of the wrong ones. So there's a game called Nier Automata. If any of you are PlayStation people, you should absolutely grab it. It's got 26 endings. And of those 26 endings, only one of them is correct. And they're all letter numbers of the alphabet. Right? And some of the endings are completely ridiculous. It's like they give you the option to delete your save file. In the game, you're playing the game so you can delete your save file. Of course I did it, because that's what's there. It's an option, right? And it literally deleted all of my progress. That's brutal, right? But to a gamer, I thought, like, two things. One, I should have known better. And two, if you give me an option, I'm going to do it. Like, that's kind of my mentality as a gamer. And so that approach to failure is really, even though it was like a brutal thing to go through, to have to replay the game from the very beginning, the concept of failure was not as dramatic as it sounded, right? It's just, I'm going to do it again. So I love that. And it kind of feeds into that optimism thing, right? And then this one I think is kind of the big one. This is epic meaning. Like, so epic meaning can come through a lot of different manners in games. But really what it comes down to is that I've done something huge, something that really I probably shouldn't have been able to do. I wouldn't be able to do it in real life. But I've accomplished something huge, and so have you. That epic requires that we have a shared understanding of success. This is a really, really fundamental thing to gamers. And when I mentioned earlier that nobody hates games more than gamers, usually those people are the vocal minority. Right? If you speak to a gamer and you both finished a game that's meaningful to you, that shared empathy of going through that process is really high. You start communicating. It's a great shortcut to a quick communication. So really, to me, the way I see these people, these gamers, your students, yourselves, is I see them as empowered, hopeful individuals. It's a shortcut too, right? There's so much more we could say about this. But I think that concept of being empowered is really important. And we're certainly seeing a drive for that in the next generation. Right? It's no longer okay to deal with the status quo. Right? And think bigger, think outside of games. Think what's happening in global politics, not just United States politics. Right? How things are changing and how we're trying to become more helpful to each other. Right? This is a really, really interesting thing to start looking at. And actually, I'm going to kind of take a really quick tangent to talk about the calculator problem. So when I was in school, I was told to not use a calculator, right? I mentioned that. Some of you probably were, some of you weren't. I know that that kind of really changed about 1985 to 1987, where they're like, that's crazy, we should be using calculators, right? But the interesting thing there is that I was taught to learn how to do those, as you learn to do those mathematical fundamentals, because when are you going to be, you'll be somewhere someday down the line where you don't have a calculator. That is an absolute lie. Like, every single person in this room has a calculator. Most of you have two. And the calculators you have on your desk that you have flopped open can process 1 billion math problems a second. Like, why wouldn't you want to learn how to use that tool? And I'm not saying you shouldn't understand the basic four fundamentals of mathematics. I think that's a very, very important thing, right? Because I knew how to put in the right thing to decide what 70% of 345 million was. I can figure out how many people are actually playing games in the United States. I know the core fundamentals. But the real truth is, I probably could have hit Siri on my phone and said, well, I could have, of course. What's 70% of $340 million? Or $340 million people. So we've kind of replaced some of those basic things that we have. And that's a good thing, because what it allows people to do is to focus on bigger things, like famine, right? World hunger is a massive problem. It's going to come back. Global climate change. Obesity, right? These are the things that you can't ask a calculator. But they require all of those things we've been talking about to kind of to solve. So it's always good to quote an economist because they're rational, are they? I don't know. This was actually about 10 years ago when this gentleman said this is we're witnessing amounts. I also wore my wrong glasses, so I can't see better. We're witnessing what amounts to no less than a mass exodus to virtual worlds and online game environments. We're absolutely seeing that. And it's going to get way bigger before it gets smaller. I'm going to talk about these really quickly. I know I'm kind of getting out of time. Right now, I know there's a couple of billionaires who are doing good things, which I know is shocking to hear. It's not normally the case. But within 3 years, we're going to have worldwide internet absolutely free across the entire world. Some interesting things are happening right now from both Amazon and Tesla, because they love to compete with each other for who's going to have the biggest piece of money, with satellite balloons that are putting out Wi-Fi signal. So you can be in the most remote place on planet Earth and have access to Wi-Fi. That's number one. The second one, if you want to read something fascinating, research tape battery. Right? So these are batteries that are as thin and flexible and small and transparent as Scotch tape. Right? And they're that small. So a tape battery that's about 1/4 of an inch by 1/4 of an inch by 1/100th of an inch. Right? That's thin. Can fit inside of its cell phone now, and that can hold enough electricity to power that phone for 30 days. We're making massive strides in how we use energy. So why that's important probably isn't for us. We're energy hogs in the United States, right? I'll charge my phone on the way home because it's not at 100%. That's 85% plugged into the car. Where this matters is people who don't have access to high-end processors, right? The reason our phones drive down so deep is because they're really complex. But if you put that into a more simple phone that can access the internet, now somebody who lives in the Sudan has access to the internet anywhere they go. Not just from safety reasons, but from research reasons. To crack their mind open, to think what their human history to this point is going to change, will make this, it'll be better for all of us. Right? It's a really fascinating concept. And a lot of that comes from removing things like calculators, removing those simple tools and giving people complex problems to solve. This is kind of my last thing I wanted to present. So these are sheep's knuckles. Right? They're bones. And it's an interesting thing because do they look like anything else? What would you do if you had a handful of those? Yeah, dice. Right? So I can't remember his name. I will think of it. Hopefully it'll pop in my head like magic. There's a Greek historian that writes a story about the people of a place called Lydia. So Lydia was the largest city in Greece at a certain time, but they were in a time of famine. They had not enough water to deal with the population that they had. They're surrounded by salt water that's not terribly helpful. They had no way to produce the amount of food. And their population had increased to the point where there was nothing they could do about it. And this was at a time when travel wasn't like it is now, right? Like, you couldn't send a bunch of people away easily. And why would you do that? Like, what a horrible thing to cut your country in half, right? And say, sorry, we can only afford half of you. So the king of Lydia decided that he was going to make a new rule. So you could only eat every other day. And on the opposite days, you played games. And this was the game that they played. It was a dice rolling game. It was highly competitive, and it was highly imaginative. So we don't really know a lot of details about what the game was, other than those, competitive and imaginative, which is a really interesting combination. But they survived in famine for 18 years doing this. 18 years. Eating every other day. I can't go until noon, right? But there is something about what was really being said here. This wasn't about famine. This was about escapism. This was about saying we have a problem as a community that's hard, it's too much for us, and what can we do to not think about that further? Gamers don't play games. Don't tell gamers that. They don't play games to play games. They play games to escape. We are going to be dealing with famine eventually. There are places across the globe that are right now. I have water rights in Ephraim. I got a letter like a week and a half ago that said we're going to pull all water rights down to 75%. Right? That's, for me, I have horses, I have hay. That's huge. That's a major consideration. So it's coming. Right? These are big global problems. It's hard to just constantly think about that stuff. I think there's some really interesting stuff happening in social media because it is that constant thing. We're constantly aware of every problem that's happening. So you can see why that move to play games has become important. The interesting result of this is that the king of Lydia did exactly what I said would be impossible. He had one final game when there was no way they could recover the environment that they had. They did not have enough water. They had ruined the environment. One final hope. And that was to play one game of dice. Split the country in half. Half of them had to leave. This is no joke. This really happened. People of Lydia left. They crossed the sea, which was an incredible adventure. And the people who stayed never heard from them again. Ever. But what we know now is that the DNA from the people who settled the Etruscan area, which is northern Africa, right, matches perfectly to the DNA of the people who remained in Lydia. So we know that this story that was told was not a story, it was history. Right? And the other interesting, fascinating thing about that is that most of the art that you think of as Egyptian art, right, you can see it, right? As soon as I say Egyptian art, you kind of can see it, came from the Etruscans. So these people who had come from severe famine had been kicked out of their land, went, started a new community, and made art. That's how we talk about a human story, right? Like that's a story of human success. So this is why I come up with that weird number of 21 billion. What this is saying is that I think that gamers should be playing 20 hours a week. All gamers across the world. So in hopes of trying to build those images that I showed you earlier, that supreme joy, that epic optimism, because we need to find those answers more globally. You're probably asking, like, what does this have to do with books? What does it have to do with you? How many of you have seen Growth Mindset? Have you heard of this? So there's a really great book. It's this one, right? So this is by Dr. Carol Dweck. She talks about growth mindset. I think, aside from Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who talked about flow, I think nothing has done more for education than this book. And I think it's going to come. My guess is that it'll hit all your school districts this next year. Like, it's one of those things. This is going to be a book you're going to want to have read. But really what it's talking about is it's talking about the difference between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. And the interesting thing that we're finding out is that we can change a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. This is not a personality. This is a conditional change that we can do by offering escapism. It's a really fascinating book. I know I'm probably Oh, I'm over time. I'm gonna go quickly here. I was gonna tell you about two different games. Does anybody recognize this? This really is kind of an obscure game. A couple of you might be shaking your heads. This is a game called The Last of Us. So this game came out about 8 years ago. There's another one, there's Last of Us 2, which kind of continues the story. But this story, I really honestly think, and this is one of those things that's like, you might be too brave to say it, but I'm gonna say it. This book will be compared equally to the way King Lear is being compared in literature now. I think it's that important of a story, and it's that well written, and it's that meaningful. If you want to know more about it, it's in my book. I'm not running out of time here. But I want to talk about this last one, and there's still 5 more minutes for me to talk about this game. So this is a game called Journey. Journey is a fascinating game because there's no text, there's no dialogue. No one speaks in this game. As a matter of fact, the chat feature, when I play with you somewhere else, has been disabled. So we can't chat. We can't talk. It's all visual. I mean, you can get this on PC, you can get it on PlayStation, you can get it kind of everywhere. Journey starts off with no rules. You're a character in the desert, you have a scarf, and you see a mountain. That's it. This is kind of like the opening screen. It's not exactly this. This is a little bit artist interpretation. You see your goal on this thing. And when you start, the only thing you can do is walk. Right? It's a pretty natural thing to hit up on your controller or an arrow key on your keyboard. And you walk. As you walk, you find your first, like a little rock that you climb off, and when you go off the edge of the rock, you glide just a teeny bit. And when you do, your scarf gets just a little bit shorter. Then as you walk, it kind of crawls up again. Right? And you kind of repeat this, and you learn more and more things as you go forward. And every time you kind of learn something new, there's a tiny cost. It eats away your scarf a little bit. But if you do it a few more times, it adds to your scarf. So the scarf becomes a really interesting metaphor for knowledge. Very, very interesting. And after you kind of get through this open desert part, you get to a part where it's pure joy. There are these old ruins, so you can tell that somebody has been there before you. It's the first kind of human-esque type stuff that you might see. But the closest thing I can compare to what you do is like snowboarding. Right? Now instead of the hills being kind of tough and you have to walk down hills, now they're all downward and you kind of glide. And when you jump and glide and learn new things, it eats away your scarf. And when you land and you do them again, you build and you see all these type of interesting things. And it's pure joy. And you get to the bottom of this play experience, and it launches you up into the air. And the game developers pull the controls away from you, they force you through something, and you fall, and you fall, and you fall. And it goes from this beautiful, warm, inviting area to absolute loneliness. You're by yourself. And all of that fun gliding is gone, because now you have to walk again, which has a cost. And as you do, there are these big, massive ribbon monsters. They come, and they've got a flashlight type thing at the front of their head. And they shine their light on you. If their light hits you with your scarf, like it's almost gone. It eats away extremely quickly. So you learn really quick that there are others watching you. Not only watching you, they're judging you. Right? They want to know what you know. And they might even want to take that from you. So you have to learn to walk in the shadows. You have to learn to be small. Right? It's like being a teenager. If you remember being a teenager, it wasn't just that you had teachers, that your teachers judged you. It's kind of their job. It's unfortunate, right? Your parents probably judged you. Even other teenagers judged you. But as you get towards the end, when it looks like there's no way to go through, there are other players that come in and their scars are white, yours is red. And these players will come through, they'll take you by your hand, and they'll walk you through the remaining difficult times. And those people that walk you through are completely, the light doesn't affect them at all. Right? Matter of fact, if those big ribbon monsters come, they'll leave if they see you with someone else. At that point, you can choose to stay with that person for the remainder of the game. You can walk with that person. And the other interesting thing about this is that it's not an AI, it's not a computer AI, it's not programmed strength, it's actually another human. But you don't have anybody to do with that. You can sing a little bit. You can push a button and it'll hum and they can hum back. It's really simple. But as you continue to walk on, there's more happiness that comes back after that moment. There's a little bit of joy, and part of that joy is just not being alone. And you'll see other people kind of paired up, kind of going on these same upward missions toward the top of this mountain. But eventually, those people with the white cloaks or the white scarves, they die. You're left alone again. And you're left 7/8 up that mountain. And the snow is so heavy that that motion that you used to have of pushing forward to walk, game developers kind of pull that away from you. Where even walking becomes extremely difficult. And even standing in place will eat away at your scarf. Till you just stop. The scarf's gone. And you turn into a ball of light. And you float to the top of the camera. And you come back down in the center of that mountain. Right? Kind of that you've made it. Well, here's the interesting thing about this game, is that whole play experience is maybe 2 hours. It's pretty short. I totally spoiled it for you. Sorry. Part of the story. But the experience that you'll have independently will be very interesting. It's very internal. Right? Like, I saw that as childhood, being a teenager, meeting my wife, going together somewhere great, hoping for something better. Right? With the knowledge that we're both going to die. That's heavy. That's not easy stuff. We're all dealing with that. You can see it, like I talk about it, I can't help it, I get emotional. We're all dealing with that, everyone in this room. Interesting thing is the next time you play the game, you have a white scarf. So, this is what I'm going to leave you with. Allow space for an epic win. In your life, in the lives of your students. If I hadn't met Mr. Perry when I was 8 years old, I have no idea where my life would be. It's tough now to grow up with awesome accommodations, with IEPs and teachers and parents and librarians and administrators that are working together to better the education of people who are struggling. I graduated from high school, but I graduated from Manti High School. Sorry, I know you're a Manti High School librarian. It wasn't hard, right? College for me was an absolute nightmare. There's no way I would have gone if I hadn't had that seed planted from somebody that said, yeah, you're different. It's okay. And if you need to read comic books to fulfill what everyone else is reading with books, that's okay too. Because he believed that I had something better to offer in that world. So, allow space for him. Thanks. I also, if I can be the shameless plug, this book, Greatest Stories Ever Played, is pretty easy to grab. I've got a few copies I'm going to leave with you, and you can share them however you want. This really is kind of digging into the deeper side of what storytelling is. How does storytelling work, and what are games doing to use that? I think this is a book for somebody who's a junior or senior in high school, probably somebody who loves their AP English class, probably somebody who is very interested in probably computer science too, even though it's way more on the literature side than on the game side of things. And then I have fiction books too, and this is one I didn't talk about. This is one that I'm super proud of. This is a book that took me 10 years to write, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. This is a book about a lonely giant who is being persecuted because of the tales of the giants of the past. And him trying to decide the difference between belonging and fitting in, and which requires the most or the least change. So that's kind of my empathy building. So if you're interested in that,
Thank you.
thanks you guys.
Thank you, Dustin.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
For sure.